and welcome to Bit Knits. Today's video is a much anticipated joining of our filet crochet squares that we've been working on for the entire 2024 year. These squares here, and I had to lay them out on my bed so you could see all of the different squares that we've done so far. These are all of the bonus squares that I have done, with the exception of the ghost up there. I have swapped out the ghost and the bat square. The bat square was actually the bonus square. The ghost square was the October filet crochet square. I swapped those two out, so I'm going to use the bat square in my blanket where I use all of the squares that we've done for January, February, March, April, May, and I'm making a separate blanket for all of these bonus squares. In this video, I am going to show you how to join these squares as you go. And we are going to use a granny shell join as you go method. We're going to start in the square on the very bottom. So the first step in this joining process is to gather all of the squares that you're going to be using, place them in the order that you want, grab a ton of yarn because joining in this way will take up a lot of yarn. So pick a color that you want to join all of these squares with. Start in the bottom right corner of your square, and we're going to work up, across, down, up, across, down, up, across, and across this way. And we're going to keep doing that all the way up our blanket, joining as we go. All right, so I have my first two squares that I'm going to be joining right next to each other. Here is the first square, second square here. I do not have enough room to put all of these squares on this table to show you, so I'm just going to do it piece by piece. Now, like I said earlier, you're going to need a lot of yarn to join these squares together, depending on how many squares you are doing for your blanket. I'm going to be joining with this gray color. It's a big twist value pound. There's tons of yards in this big ball, so I shouldn't run out of it, I'm hoping. We are also going to be using a 4.5 millimeter crochet hook, just like we have done for each of these squares throughout the year. You're going to join with a slip knot on your hook. Grab your first square, and we're going to be starting in this very bottom right corner. So make sure your squares are all right side up. These squares do not typically have a right and wrong side. It just depends sometimes on how that pattern or design that we've worked looks one way or the other. In that corner, you can see that we've got a space between those double crochets that we've done. So you can see you've got a space there, a space on the next row, a space on the next row, and so on. We are going to be working in these spaces, so you're just going to join into that first row space between your double crochets, and you're going to join with a slip stitch. So you just want to join your joining color with a slip stitch right in that space between those last two double crochets. We're going to chain 3 and work 2 more double crochets right back into that same space. We're going to chain 1, skip the next row, so skip that next space, find the next row's space, and work a shell. So 3 double crochets all into that same space. chain 1, skip the next row space, find the next row and work a shell, so 3 double crochets into that space. Chain 1, skip the next row space, find the next, and 3 double crochets. So keep working this all the way up that right side of your first square, and I will meet you at the top corner. I am working into the second to last space, so what would be row 19 on our square. I've just put a shell or 3 double crochets into that space there. We've got our last row, so our last space. We're going to skip that space and we're going to work 3 double crochets into the very first stitch, so the top of that end double crochet essentially. We want to chain 1 in between all of our shells, and you can see I've skipped and chained 1 along the side. So into that top stitch you're going to work your corner and try to get through both of the loops on that corner stitch. You work a shell, so 3 double crochets, chain 3 because we're at a corner, and right back into that same stitch we're going to work 3 double crochets. And we've got our corner. We're going to do the same thing along the top, but we're going to chain 1 in between our shells, skip 2 stitches, and work 3 stitches into the very next stitch. So you're always on this first square going to be chaining 1 in between shells, and along the top we chain 1, skip 2 stitches, 3 double crochet into the next. Chain 1, skip 2, 3 double crochet into the next. So repeat that along the top and I will meet you back at the corner. So I've worked my last shell. I've got 2 stitches to skip and into that corner stitch. So that very end stitch we're going to work a corner. So again we go into the stitch and work 3 double crochet, chain 3, 3 double crochet to create our corner. And all into that same stitch. We're going to flip our work, so we're working on the other side now. We're going to chain 1, that first row space right here we're going to skip. So row 20 from our filet crochet square, we are skipping that space. Go to the next space in between double crochets, so that is row 19 from our filet crochet square, and work your shell. And we're going to do this down the side just like we worked up the opposite side. Always chain 1, skip the next space, find the next space, and work your shell into it. So I'm going to keep working this down the side, and I will meet you at the bottom left corner of our square. So I've worked that short side and I am down at our bottom left corner. So you can see I've worked 3 sides, and I apologize, it's a little tight for space on this desk that I'm working on. So we started in the bottom right, we worked up the side, across the top, and down this other side. So I am all the way down. We're going to leave this bottom edge undone for now. However, if you just want to create this granny shell border around each square, you would go ahead and work this side, cut your yarn, finish off, go to the next square, do the same thing. Then you can join your squares, sewing them up in whatever preferred method that you like to sew your granny squares together. But for this tutorial, we are going to do the join as you go. So I've chained one, I'm going to skip this next space, and now here is that row 1 on the bottom. It is where we started. That row 1, we worked in that first space to start this border. So we're just going to work 3 double crochets into that space. Again, if you were working these squares individually and you just wanted to add this border onto each square without joining as you go continuously, you would chain 3 and work 3 double crochets right back into that same space, chain 1, skip 2 stitches along the bottom, 3 double crochets in the next, chain 1, skip 2, 3 double crochets in the next, all the way along that bottom edge. And then you could fasten off, weave in your ends, grab your next square, and do the same thing. For the join as you go, once you get to this point, we're going to leave this edge flat. So we are not going to finish that corner yet. We're going to chain 3, because that's what we have been chaining for each corner, and right into this first space. So there's our row 1 from our fillet square. We're going to work 3 double crochets right into that space. And at this point you can kind of flip your work around. So there's a lot of movement in joining continuously as you go. Now, instead of chaining 1, we're going to find that chain 1 we did from our first square, or the square directly to your right, and you're just going to slip stitch, and now we've got the start of a join. We're going to skip the next space on our, well, my pink square, but whatever square you're working, move to the next, 3 double crochets into that space, stop, find the next space. So we just worked into this one, we're going to slip stitch into the next, pull that up. I didn't get that quite right. For some reason this yarn tends to be splitting on me today. Alright, there's my last double crochet. Find the next space on your right square, slip stitch, skip the next space in between your double crochets, so skip that row, go to the next, 3 double crochets. And you're going to work this pattern all the way up, and I will show you then what to do when you reach this top corner. I'm coming up close to the top. Always remember to skip a row before working your shell into the next space of the next row. And when we're joining, with a slip stitch, that slip stitch really essentially counts as our chain one. So when you're working a fresh square where you're not continuously joining, you're not slip stitching to another square, you're going to chain one in between those shells. When you are joining a square to a previously shelled square, all you want to do is slip stitch. At the top, so I'm right here, I've got a row here, I'm going to skip into, again, that top stitch, whatever stitch you can find. It's the very top. Now some of these are going to be harder because you can see that's where I fastened off, so I don't have a very clean stitch to work into. We are going to ignore this, so we're not going to be joining. We've slip stitched here. I'm going to work 3 double crochets. I'm going to try to find a good spot to join. So 3 double crochets right into that very first stitch. Chain 3. That's for our corner. Remember, ignore this, pretend it doesn't exist. We're going to come back to it. We've chained 3, and into that same stitch we're going to work 3 more double crochets, and this will be our first, our top right corner for our second square. And now we've got 2 more edges to work where we are not joining, so we're going to do the same thing that we did over here. Chain 1, skip 2 stitches, 3 double crochets into the next. Chain 1, skip 2, 3 double crochets into the next, and so on all the way down or across this top row. When you get to the corner, you're going to work your corner, so 3 double crochets, chain 3, 3 double crochets into that top stitch. Do not work into that space. You're going to skip that space and work directly into the space from that second row, what would be row 19 of our filet crochet square. So if you're confused, just go back to where I show you this first square, follow that exactly, and I will show you then down here we're going to do the same thing that we did over here. So I'm going to work those 2 sides, and I'll be back once I do that, and we will join what is my last square for this bottom row. Alright, so I've worked the top, the left side, I've got my 3 double crochets into that very first space, what would be our row 1 from the actual filet crochet square. We're going to grab our next square. So for me, that is the music notes. I'm going to go ahead, chain 3, and again we're going to work a double crochet into that first space. Double crochet 3 times, so there's 1, I'm going to work our shell, 2, 1 more time, 3, and this is the same thing that we did joining these squares together. We're going to find our first space here. We're not going to chain 1, we're just going to slip stitch to join those squares together, skip the next space or next row, work into the following row, 3 double crochets, find our next space on our previous square, slip stitch, skip a row over here, so that space from that row, go into the next, and work your shell. You're going to do the same thing all the way up, just like we did for this pink square, all the way up and around if you have another square to join to this one. If not, work up and across the top, and I will meet you on that very left hand corner, and we will start working the next row. When you've gone across the top of your last square, you're going to stop with that last shell and leave this left side a raw edge, so you're not going to be working down this final left square. To continue, the next square that we're going to work into is the one that goes right above your left square, your bottom left square. So however you have set up your squares, you're going to grab the one that goes directly above this bottom left square. We're going to start with a chain 3, and I'm going to kind of rotate my work so it's easier to work into. So I've got my chain 3, I'm going to pick up my next square, and you want to work into the bottom left corner. Into that first stitch, we're going to be working 3 double crochets. So you chain 3 and then you work 3 double crochets into that first stitch. So if I move you a little closer, you can see that first stitch. We've got the chain 3 and 3 double crochets into that very bottom left stitch from your next square above the one that we just worked into. So I'm going to kind of rotate my work. We're going to find our next space here in between our shells and slip stitch. So put your hook in, grab that yarn, pull it up. This is a little bit fiddly, especially on camera, and slip stitch. We're going to skip 2, so 1, 2, and into the next we're going to work our 3 double crochets. Find the next space over here, slip stitch, slip stitch into it, skip 2 on your square that you're working those new shells into. So just worked into that one, 1, 2, and work 3 double crochets into the next. Find the next space in between shells on your previous square and slip stitch. Skip 2 on this one, 1, 2, and 3 double crochets into the next. So you're going to keep working this along that bottom edge here, connecting this new square to that square that we just worked across previously. When you get to these open corners, I will show you what to do. So keep working along, slip stitching into each of these spaces as you go along, skipping 2 and working 3 into the next along this raw edge down here to connect these 2 squares, and I will meet you back at this point. Alright, you can see that I've worked across, attaching this next square to the blanket. I've got my shell here. I've got one more space before that corner, so I'm going to go ahead, slip stitch into it, and now I'm going to work 3 double crochets into that last stitch. So you're skipping 2 again, work into the last stitch, and work my 3 double crochets into that very last stitch, and this is going to be the start of our corner. So I've got my start of this corner here. Now we have these 2 corners left open. We are going to ignore this corner here. Ignore it. So the corner that is on that bottom left square, we're going to join up at a later time. Ignore it for now. You're going to go to the diagonal corner. We're going to chain 1. We're going to work a slip stitch into that corner space, diagonal to the square that we're working, slip stitch into it, chain 1, pick up your next square. You might have to readjust your blanket as you work. So if at this point, as you're adding in additional squares, it's a good idea to lay the blanket out as you pick up your next square to make sure that you've got this square going the right way. It's not upside down, it's not facing the wrong way. Set it up as it needs to be attached, and then re-rotate your work back so it's easy to work into. So you've picked up your next square, you've got your chain 1, slip stitch into the diagonal corner, and a chain 1. We're going to do the same thing along a raw edge here. We're going to find that very corner stitch, and we're going to work 3 double crochets into it. Oops, we want 3 double crochets, so we want to shell into that very first stitch, or as close to as possible. And I just wound up going into that space in between my double crochets to make it easier on myself. And you're going to do the same thing. You're going to find the next space on the next square in between those shells and slip stitch, skip 2, and work 3 double crochet into the next, all along this raw edge. Find that space, slip stitch, skip 2, and 3 double crochets into the next. So you're going to do this all along this next square. When you get to this next corner, you're going to do the same thing. You're going to ignore that corner space that falls right below the square that you're working on. You want to go into the diagonal one. You're going to chain 1, slip stitch, chain 1, pick up your next square, work 3 double crochets into the bottom left corner, and continue on. I'm going to join these next 2 squares for my blanket, and I will meet you at the end on the far right side at the end of this row, and I will show you how to attach and continue on with joining the squares. I have worked those next two squares, joining them to those bottom squares. There's where I ignored this corner, worked diagonally, joined my next square, working across, and here we are. So I'm going to skip those last 2 stitches and work 3 double crochets into that very last stitch, or if it's too difficult to find that last stitch, into that space between your double crochets is fine. But I'm going to try to find a stitch, work my 3 double crochets, And now when you're at the end, so here's our side where we worked up our very far right first square, we're going to join that corner. To do that, you want to chain 1, work a slip stitch into that corner space, and chain 1, turn to the side, and you're going to work as you did with this first square up the side. So to finish this corner right here, we need to work 3 double crochets into that corner, same stitch that we started the corner, and then you get that nice even edge. For the sides, chain 1 in between your shells. We're going to skip the next space here, so what would be row 2 from our filet crochet square, and into the next we're going to work our 3 double crochets or our shell. Chain 1, skip a row, and into the next row work a shell. So you're going to work in this manner just like we worked for those first 3 squares. So you're going to work like we did for this square and over. So I'm going to work up the side, creating a corner at the top, work along the top of that square, and I know it's kind of hard to see. I do not have a big enough setup here to show you this in full. You're going to work across that top, working your corner in the left hand part of your square. Work down just like we did for the first row of squares, and when you get to the point down here where we need to join in this corner, that is where I will meet you up at. So I'm going to work around, working those shells, skipping 2 stitches or 1 row on these side edges of my square, and then I'll meet you right back here at this first corner join down here. Alright, so I've worked around this next square, and I am back right here where we need to join up this corner here. I'm going to rotate my work just a little bit so it's easier for me to work. Here is that first shell that we started. It's part of our corner. So you can see I work down this side here. When you get to that point, you're going to work 3 double crochets into that corner, same stitch, and that will complete this square's corner. Chain 1, and now here's where we join up to that diagonal corner here from our diagonal square. So I've chained 1, pull up on your hook, take the hook out, find that diagonal corner. So here's where we joined those 2 together. We're going to put our hook in to that space, and you're going to go under that join that you did for your other 2 squares. So you should have 2 what look like loops on your hook. You're going to come now and put that loop, the working yarn loop, on your hook, and you're just going to pull through, chain 2, find that square, your next square that you're going to work into, right here. So here's the 3 shells that we did to start that corner. We need to finish that corner now. We're going to work 3 double crochets into that corner, that same stitch where those other 3 double crochets were worked into, and that will give us the corner. So we just joined right there. We're now going to work up this side. So as we've done for the previous row of squares, just worked 3 double crochets to complete that corner. We're going to find the next space from this square and slip stitch. We're now going to skip row 2 from this square, work into the next space here, that next row, and work our set of shells, so our set of 3 double crochets I should say. So 3 double crochets to get a shell. Find the next space over on your previous square, slip stitch, skip a row, find the next, and work your shells. And that is how we join as you go for the middle rows. Depending on how many rows or columns that you have, you can continue to work this pattern just as we did. So I'm going to work up this square over just as we did for the first row. When you come to your next join, where you need to join this corner, do what we just did over here. Continue to work up this square, over and around. This happens to be my last square for my left hand edge. Do the same thing that we did over here. You want to work your 3 double crochets, chain 3, and work immediately into that bottom corner, 3 double crochets. Work your next set of squares over, up, around. So I'm going to finish all of my rows of squares, and once I get to the very top, and then we'll work that final joining row to create a flat edge on the top and the corners, and you will have all of your filet crochet squares joined. Alright, I am up at the top of my blanket, so you can see I've worked around for this first, or the top right square, some of the very top. So here's my actual corner of the blanket, the top right corner of the blanket. My top right square is this sort of light pink, so I've worked down just as we have normally. I joined that corner here, started working up. So here is the next square along my top row of the blanket. Normally we would be leaving these corners unattached to each other as we've done in the middle part of our blanket, but since this is the top and it needs to be a straight edge connected to each other, we're going to connect these 2 corners together as we get to them on this very top row. So to do that, you can see I've worked my shell into the top last stitch, or that space here in this next square. All you want to do is chain 1, find that chain space from your right square, the square right to your right, slip stitch, chain 1, and then continue on. So what you would do is work your 3 double crochets right back into that same spot where you worked that shell, and just work your 3 double crochets. Chain 1, skip 2 stitches, 3 double crochets into the next. So it's worked very much in the same way as we've been working all of the rest of our rows, our squares, as we join them up. The only difference is at the top here, you are going to connect those two corners together with a chain one, slip stitch, chain one, and then continue the granny shell pattern all the way around. So you're going to create that corner here on your next corner, work down the side just as we have been for this entire blanket, join your corners here in the center, work back up your next square, and this happens to be my last square for this row. You would work half that corner and join it to the corner that you've worked for this square. So then those would be joined, work across, all the way across in the granny shell pattern, work your corner here. Here is my unfinished left side. So I'm going to work all the way down, and here is where we have that chain 3 that we worked to get up to our next square. These are worked a little bit differently, so I'm going to work all the way around my blanket, working that granny shell. When I get here, I will show you how to work into that chain 3 space, continue on, and finish the joining of our filet crochet squares. Alright, so I have worked and attached all of my squares together. They're all joined, so I'm just working that outer left hand side of my blanket. Here's my first join here along that side at the top. So here's my corner. I've worked down that square. We're back down here where here is the next square down on my blanket. You've worked half of a shell into that bottom left hand square, so of my blue square. I'm going to go ahead and work the second half of that corner, so 3 double crochets into the same spot as that shell is already worked into. Now we're going to chain 1. We've got that chain 3 here. We're just going to slip stitch into it, chain 1, come over to this square here. We've already worked half of our shell, or our corner I should say. We've worked half of our corner into that stitch, so I'm just going to work the second half of it to create that full corner. So 3 double crochets right into that same stitch that we had started our corner in, and now you've got a nice straight edge along the side. So you're going to do that every time you come to a spot along the unfinished, unworked side, left side of your blanket and bottom. You're going to have that chain 3 here. You're going to do the same thing. Work the second half of your shell right into that same stitch that you worked that first half of your corner, chain 1, slip stitch, chain 1, 3 double crochets right into that next corner stitch that you already started. Work along the side, and then you'll come to another chain 3, do the same thing. You're always going to want to chain 1, slip stitch into that chain 3 space, chain 1, and then continue finishing the second part of your corner until you get all the way to where we started, right back here, and that's the bottom right side of my blanket. So when you come down here, I'm going to work 3 double crochets, chain 3 to kind of get around that corner, and slip stitch into that first stitch from that very first shell that we did to start our joining. I'm going to go ahead and finish that up, and then I'm going to lay this out so you can see how absolutely neat this blanket looks all joined together. Before I do that, a few quick reminders as you're working this blanket. When you're working along a side or in the center of your blanket, where you're not joining to a previously shelled side. You always want to chain one in between your shells. When you are joining a square to a side that already has these shells, you don't need to chain one. You're just going to slip stitch in those spaces, in those chain one spaces, and then continue on. For the center joins, as you come to them, you always work diagonally to join, and when you're working into these filet crochet squares, on the sides where you've got those, you can see the rows very obviously. You always want to skip a row before working your next shell. That will count as your skip 2. When you're working on the top and you have actual stitches, which obviously I don't here, okay, so, and you have the actual stitches, you're going to skip 2 stitches, work 3 double crochet into the next. You always want to make sure that your shells are matching up, so as you're working through this blanket, you can look at the square that you've already worked shells into and just double check that here I worked into this first row, skipped a row, I worked those 3 double crochets, my shell, into the next row, so I made sure on this next square as I was joining that I had them lined up correctly. And if you remember a few of those simple tips, this blanket join will be super easy. Now again, if you're finding that this is just way too much, way too complicated, and you want something super easy, just work a shell, granny shell border around each individual square, and you can join them however you want. I'm going to go ahead and finish my shell stitch around those 2 unfinished edges, and I will be right back to show you how this blanket looks. Here we are, all of our filet crochet bonus squares joined together using the granny shell stitch. I just think it worked up perfectly, especially using that granny shell stitch. So you can see it gives it a nice border, does not take away from the squares themselves at all, almost frames each square. I will have another video of the squares that I've used for the actual months, so January, February, March. These are just my bonus squares so I could show you how to get started on joining all of the squares together. And look forward very soon. We've got our November square coming up in the next week, and of course we'll have December's square on December 1st. Thanks so much for watching. Until next time, happy filet crochet joining squares, everyone.